We have some breaking news tonight. I'm Marnie Hughes, Leland Vittert here. We want to get to the results of the Ohio Senate GOP primary tonight. And Leland, I don't know that this is a surprise, and it's actually coming earlier than many anticipated.
Yeah, JD Vance, winner in the Buckeye State in a primary that pitted Trump Republicans against more traditional conservatives and tested the influence of the former president. Tonight, the Trump candidate, that is the Trump endorsed candidate, came out on top. NewsNation and Decision Desk HQ is projecting JD Vance to be the winner of the Ohio primary. He will go on to face the Democrat come November, Tim Ryan. Let's go to Chris Steyerwalt, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, columnist for The Dispatch, with us now. Chris, I remember you suggesting Hillbilly Elegy to me as a book now, 4 or 5 years ago? And who would have thought we would be talking about best-selling author to Senate candidate JD Vance?
Well, there's been about 3 or 4 JD Vances in between there. I don't know that I recommended the book. I was probably just talking about me being a hillbilly. I don't know. I just heard the call, and we know that there's still about half of the vote out. The Decision Desk team is it's primo stuff. I'm sure their call is the right one. But we will see probably by the time this is done, there's still a ton of vote out in Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus. And so far, Dolan has performed well in those places. So I don't think this is going to look like, in the end, a runaway. And it's also a split decision in Ohio. And I think one of the most interesting things is how well Mike DeWine did in his primary for governor. If you'll recall, at a certain point, Mike DeWine was a real villain in the eyes of the MAGA movement and the populist nationalists in the Republican Party like Vance. And they came after him for his stances on COVID and for refusing to try to undermine the results of the 2020 election, and on and on. He won easily. LaRose, the sitting Secretary of State, who didn't go along with any of the reindeer games that they tried to play with the election results, he was returned too. So while there's certainly a lot to take away from in Ohio in terms of what the implications are for the rest of the country, we should remember that there's more going on under the surface here than meets the eye.
Absolutely. Well, and Chris, you and I talked about this earlier, but the Trump effect on this race, particularly early on in Ohio, evident tonight, but more importantly, is how it will impact the other primaries that we've got in the coming weeks. You say Georgia is the one that you're watching.
Yeah, Georgia is sort of this. We're going to play the Super Bowl for the Republicans down in Georgia this year. This is round one. Trump's chosen candidate projected to win there, and that is definitely a big brevet promotion for Trump's fledgling effort to have a real sort of political organization. Because if you think about it this way, Trump won in 2016 without an organization. In 2020, he relied on the Republican National Committee substantially. This is him and his team trying to make this is not just a test for the nationalist movement inside the Republican Party, but also what would a Trump primary, or what would a Trump Republican primary bid look like for president in 2024? So this is all of those things at once. Georgia is so important because down in Georgia you have a state that Trump falsely claims that he won. Brian Kemp, the conservative, very conservative governor down there, under severe pressure from Trump to try to change the results of the election. So Trump really targeted him, but so far Kemp has held on. Question tonight is, will this change the way Georgians are thinking about things? Will it change the way Trump thinks about the race? Is he going to double down on Georgia? What will we see between here and there? It's going to be a lot of good politics to watch.
Yeah, you have the establishment versus Donald Trump now in Georgia because you have George W. Bush now headlining a fundraiser for Kemp. You have one of Mike Pence's old aides heading down there to help him as well. Pivot back to Ohio for a second. The knock always on the Trump candidate is that he picks some really fire and brimstone, very Trumpy MAGA-ite in a primary that does great in the primary and then just gets shellacked in a contested general election. Is JD Vance have that potential when he takes on Tim Ryan, or is Vance conventional enough that he's going to be able to have a real shot at the Ohio Senate seat?
Well, look, I think Mandel would have been sort of empirically the worst choice for Republicans in Ohio. He is weird in the layered. He's like a baklava of weirdness. It's too much. Vance has only a few layers of his weirdness. He has reinvented himself a few times. He was an establishmentarian kind of guy, and then reinvented himself again. Can he now pivot back, right? Can he now pivot back and act normal in a general election? I don't know. Tim Ryan is a good choice for the Democrats. Ohio is now a solidly red state, not by a lot, but it's pretty solid. We should remember Sherrod Brown, the other senator from Ohio, is not just a Democrat; he's a liberal Democrat. And Tim Ryan wants to be that sort of pro-union, working class, blue collar Democrat. And he also has a record of opposing Nancy Pelosi for Speaker and bucking his own party. And he's going to be running to be kind of a Joe Manchin from Ohio. And what he's going to try to do is say that JD Vance is not just a phony, but also a radical, and that he's too much of a risk for Ohio, and he's going to put himself in that place. Now we'll see whether Vance can flip back a little bit to the persona that he previously presented.
Yeah, the 24 hours have taught us anything, right? That it's a long time until November as we look at pictures of Tim Ryan. He just tweeted out a poll 37-36 with a head-to-head matchup of him and Vance. Does the Senate races especially change drastically with the leak of Roe potentially being overturned? And obviously we'll know whether it is or not come June.
Well, here's the thing. This isn't. It will have some effect. I don't want to say it'll have no effect. It'll have a modest effect on persuadable voters. What this is an intensifier for the Democratic base, and what Tim Ryan will be able to say. Now, we've seen there's a House race in Ohio where you have a mainstream Democrat defeating a Bernie Sanders progressive. Right now, it looks like Ohio Democrats are in line. This will help Tim Ryan and other Democrats around the country say to their base, look, you got no choice. You got to stick with me, and therefore you have to give me room to maneuver, whether it's here in Ohio, whether it's Mark Kelly in Arizona, across the country. These Senate Democratic candidates are going to be able to say to their base, we can't afford to get tangled up on woke stuff. We can't afford to get tangled up on culture war stuff. You've got to let me reach out to suburban, persuadable voters so that we can win this election because the stakes are too high. So by raising the stakes, perhaps it will increase Democratic solidarity going into a tough midterm season.
Well, and Chris, the question will be, how do they try to frame the discussion, right? I mean, is it Roe v. Wade driving people to the polls? Is it inflation? Is it rising energy costs? Is it the fact that people are sick of COVID-19 and they have fatigue over how states and the federal government have handled it? How will they frame that as we get closer to November, and who comes out looking the best, or I guess looking not the worst?
So it would be like if Leland and I were playing golf. He is so much better than me. He would have to give me some strokes, right? He'd have to give me a bunch of strokes so that we would be on some sort of parity
going on right now. I don't know. Somehow this is going to come back
true.
to bite me on a first tee somewhere.
It's absolutely true. So the Democrats know that it's going to be a bad year, and they know they're probably going to lose the House. They'd like to hold down the margin of defeat, and they'd like to keep the Senate, if they can't keep it all the way, to keep it so that it's functionally tied, and you can't get the Republicans couldn't get big legislation through. The question for the persuadable voters who will decide this election is pretty simple. Who can act normal and not be a freak and talk about every niche issue that relates to Walt Disney World and everything else under the sun, and who can focus on the issues that people care about? And this cycle, it's really 1.5 things. It's like 1.75 things. It's the economy and prices and inflation, energy costs, all of that as a unit, and Ukraine. Now, Roe will have its own effects. What Walt Disney lobbies in Florida will have, like all of these things will have their effect on already engaged, already partisan voters. But if I were a Democrat or a Republican, I would not want to talk about anything but how I'm going to help bring down energy costs. I would not want to talk about anything but how we're going to make sure that we're not in a recession. And I would not want to talk about anything other than how we're going to make sure that Vladimir Putin doesn't turn the Black Sea into a Russian bathtub. So those, I would just really focus in on that place. And then, of course, make sure that you tell everybody that your opponent's a lunatic.
Well, yeah, that goes without saying. And I would tell you on the first tee that you're a much better golfer than I am. But as we look at the primary schedule going forward, you think about this Glenn Youngkin type model for a Republican, the MAGA without the crazy. You're Tim Ryan, you're describing Biden without the progressive tilt. We'll have to figure out what Democrat writes that book, the Joe Manchin model. Between Tim Ryan and JD Vance, who has farther to go from their primary positions to that really sweet spot where conceivably they can carve out what you were talking about?
Well, Vance is now finally famous in Ohio. For a long time, he was a nationally famous person, but we saw in polls his name recognition in Ohio, his home state, wasn't that high. He's from just north of Cincinnati over in the southwestern part of the state. And outside, even there, but outside of that part, not particularly famous. So he has been introduced to Ohio basically as Tucker Carlson of the Senate. That is the guise in which he has come. Now, we know from his prior versions of himself that he has presented as a venture capitalist, as an author, as all of these things, that he can talk the language of normal politics. And what I want to see is this. There are a lot of people who gave money, big business guys, who gave a lot of money to JD Vance on the premise that he was faking, that this is the stuff that he had to say and do to get through the Republican primary. And now that he's on the other side, he will shake off some of this and move. But he is clearly the one who has got to move, because Tim Ryan has basically carved out this space throughout his career. He has dedicated the past 20 years, to telling Ohioans that he is a dissident, moderate Democrat trapped in a very liberal party. And the blowback, by the way, that Tim Ryan gets from Democrats on his ads when he talks about what's wrong with the Democratic Party just reminds me of the famous Joe Manchin ad where he took out a deer rifle and shot the cap and trade legislation when he was running for Senate 10 years ago. This is what Tim Ryan needs. He needs the more bad stuff Tim Ryan could get Nancy Pelosi to say about him, the more it will help him in Ohio.
We've seen what that's done in West Virginia for Joe Manchin. Bad things said about him by AOC and by others. Joe Manchin's numbers, Marnie, have never been higher. I thought Chris made a great point about big money guys. The one name you have to think about is Peter Thiel, who's put millions behind JD Vance.
Yep. Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.